Well, good morning. Winking at Jessica. She's online this morning. If you would, let's all open our Bibles together today to the book of John, chapter 12. As Amanda and Isaiah wonderfully said already today is the beginning of Holy Week. That was the final week of Jesus' ministry before his crucifixion on Good Friday and his resurrection on Easter Sunday. Sometimes people refer to Holy Week as his Passion Week. And I think it's interesting that passion and suffering come from the same origins. People are willing to suffer for something when they're passionate about it. And we call this particular Sunday at the beginning of Holy Week Palm Sunday because, again, as Amanda shared, it refers to the way the people welcomed Jesus into the city of Jerusalem. When he entered the city on Palm Sunday, he was greeted by followers, children, religious adversaries, and tourists. Palm Sunday and Holy Week occurred during the Jewish Passover festival. And during Passover, the population of the city of Jerusalem would swell to 2 or 3 times its normal size because of all the worshiping tourists that would descend on the city. And many of them greeted Jesus by waving palm branches in the air. And they waved these branches as a sign of honor and worship and welcome. His entrance into the city was prophetic and subversive on so many levels. He was the King of Kings entering his holy city, but he entered his city in absolute humility, riding on a donkey, surrounded by peasants and commoners and critics. Rome was the world ruler of that day. And when a conquering Roman general returned to their hometown, it was the opposite of the way Jesus entered his city. In fact, I want to read you a quick essay entry from my daily devotional book, When Storms Speak. So if you're reading this devotional with a lot of us, you read this just a few days ago. But this entry is called Not the Conquering Warlord. A donkey, a red carpet made of cast-aside robes, palm branches waved in the air, and little children shouting, Hosanna. That was the extent of the pomp and circumstance with which Jesus commenced his Passion Week. It was hardly the entrance of a conquering hero. Indeed, the Roman warlords of that day would have scorned such a humble entrance. Jesus was only days away from defeating sin, death, hell, and the grave, and yet he entered Jerusalem in simplicity and approachability. It was vintage Jesus. From the moment of his birth, when common shepherds helped Joseph and Mary count his fingers and toes, to dinners with both preachers and prostitutes, to this innocuous entrance into Jerusalem, Jesus made himself reachable to the average person. In fact, after this ignoble entrance into the city, he even removed his robe and washed the sweaty feet of his followers. It was hardly the actions of a Caesar or a Greek god. Yet it embodied the actions of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Ours is a backwards kingdom. We push the down button to go up. We serve to be great. We give our lives away to find them. And our King approaches Palm Sunday amid the laughter and delight of little children. That was Palm Sunday. Today, I want us to go to John chapter 12, and I want us to back up to the Saturday evening before Palm Sunday. And I want us to look at some powerful, critical events that occurred right at the beginning of Holy Week, and this will help set the tone for our Holy Week today, but it can also actually set the tone for our entire lives if we're able to see this and catch hold of it today. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about how life happens. Everyone in my generation remembers the film Braveheart. And even though Jessica is begging me to update my movie references in my talks, none of us who have ever seen Braveheart will forget William Wallace's quote when he said, "Every man dies, but not every man really lives." Well, in John chapter 12, Jesus was in the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, the man that Jesus raised from the dead one chapter prior in John chapter 11. The raising of Lazarus from the dead was one of the final signs, one of the very last signs that Jesus did before his Passion Week. And the raising of Lazarus from the dead was the catalyst that became the trigger that led to the events that actually brought on Jesus' own arrest and crucifixion and execution. Right after he raises Lazarus in John 11, you read how the plot to kill Jesus intensified and went into full effect. And in John chapter 12, on the night before this Holy Week happened, it says this. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, which was typical of Martha because that was her gift. That was how she worshiped Jesus. And many of you have that same gift, and that's how you worship Jesus. Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him, and then Mary. And this is the Mary from Luke chapter 10 who was sitting at Jesus' feet listening to his word. Mary took about a pint of pure nard, and that is not a very attractive word in English, but it was an expensive perfume, and she poured it on Jesus' feet. Other accounts of this story tell us that she poured it on his head and his feet, and that makes sense because this particular perfume was very expensive, and it was imported from northern India, and it was used to anoint or perfume a loved one's head. So she pours it on his head, and she pours it on his feet, and she wiped his feet with her hair. And that act of wiping his feet with her hair would have created an incredible stir because in that day, a Jewish woman would never unbind and let down her long hair unless she was alone with her husband. And this sheds some light onto another instance from Jesus' life when a few years earlier, a prostitute crashed a dinner party, falls at Jesus' feet, and if you recall, she's weeping at his feet. She wets his feet with her tears, and then she uses her long hair to dry his feet. And everybody who was watching that said, "Scandal! This is scandalous. Doesn't he realize who she is and what she's doing and how she should only do that in front of her husband?" They missed the entire overarching message. She was meeting her true husband, God, in that moment. And so this house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. How much money do you make in a year? Anybody want to volunteer? Have you managed to save up a year's worth of income somewhere? Somehow this woman believed that Jesus was worth this extravagant act of worship. Judas did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He was the keeper of the money bag, and he used to help himself to what was put into it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It is intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." And then when Matthew and Mark told this story, they quoted Jesus as also saying, "Wherever this gospel gets preached all around the world, what she has done will be remembered." And that's true. We're talking about it right now. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there, and they came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priest made plans to kill Lazarus as well. How would you like to be Lazarus? And you're raised from the dead, and they're immediately trying to kill you again. There was an old James Bond film in 1967 called "You Only Live Twice." And for Lazarus, it was true. You know, he lived and died, and he was raised, and then they're trying to kill him again. They're trying to kill him because on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. And then we get to verse 12 where it says, the next day. The next day was Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week and the triumphal entry of Jesus. And the countdown timer for the execution of Jesus began ticking. The raising of Lazarus from the dead triggered Jesus' own death and execution. But it wasn't the first time he raised someone from the dead. You remember that, right? There was something about Lazarus' raising that drove them to eventually kill him. But he actually raised a couple of other people from the dead. Do you remember these? The first one happened in Luke chapter 7, when Jesus raised the only son of a widow from a town called Nain. I love this story. Picture this story with me. I love the imagery. It's just breathtaking. I love the story because Nain was a town built on a hill. And the text in Luke 7 tells us that this funeral procession was leaving the city, which means they were traveling downhill. Jesus was coming into the city, which means he was traveling uphill. Now, we don't always do this in our culture today, but you will recall that sometimes if you're at a funeral or a wedding, there is a funeral or a wedding procession. And when we all line up in our cars and start driving to or from the event, traffic gets stopped because nobody is allowed to interrupt a funeral procession or a wedding procession. In fact, the only thing that's allowed to stop a funeral procession is a bridal procession. And so in the larger drama of this story, death is coming down the hill and life is coming up the hill. And the funeral procession yields to the bridal procession where Jesus, the bridegroom, approaches this dead young man and speaks to him and says, young man, I say to you, get up. And he does. And he restores him to his widowed mother. The second event happened in the very next chapter in Luke chapter 8. And you'll remember this story. A man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, had lost his little 12-year-old girl. He hadn't lost her yet, actually. She was terminally ill. And he finds Jesus and he falls at Jesus' feet and he begs him to heal his little girl. And Jesus says, of course I will. So they start traveling to meet Jairus' little girl. And on the way, a crowd forms. And a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years pushes through the crowd, grabs the hem of Jesus' robe, pulls a miracle out of him. He feels the power leave him, and he's like, hold on a second. Who touched me? She comes forward. She tells her story. And imagine if you were Jairus. Wait a minute. How long has she been bleeding? Wait, you've been bleeding for 12 years, and we're on the way to heal my 12-year-old daughter? Are the 12s a coincidence? I think Jairus' faith must have been just ratcheting up as he's hearing the story. Well, his little girl dies. But Jesus still goes with him, and so instead of healing her, he actually raises her back to life. So the raising of Lazarus wasn't the first time Jesus healed somebody, and yet those other times, those didn't generate a death sentence. So what was it about Lazarus? Why was this the kickoff to the Passion Week? Well, when Jesus was talking to Martha about her dead brother, in John 11:23, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. But Jesus said to her, no. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. This is the strongest, clearest declaration and affirmation of the identity and the mission and the purpose of Jesus. And the reaction to this led to not only his death, but the most brilliant picture of the most powerful truth in all of human history. And I don't think I can hype it up anymore. So here it is. In the kingdom of God, life comes out of death. In the kingdom of God, life comes out of death. This is the principle to start Holy Week with, and this is the principle to orient our lives around. We don't wear crosses as jewelry because they remind us of death. We wear crosses and we get cross tattoos because they remind us that death is not the final word. There is nothing more terrifying to the human race than death. And yet, there's something greater than death on the scene. In fact, not only has something greater come on the scene, but death has now become its servant. Death is actually the portal to new life. I mean, have you seen this in your life? Have you seen this in your relationships? I die to my pride, and wow, suddenly people enjoy being around me more. I die to my dishonesty, and suddenly new trust is born. I die to my gluttony or my sugar cravings, and suddenly there's new fitness and new health and energy that I experience. I die to my bitterness and my unforgiveness, and wow, I'm free. It's a universal principle based in the reality of God as resurrection and the life. Seed dies before it bears fruit. Spring goes through winter first. Butterflies start out as caterpillars that go through a process that looks an awful lot like death. Jessica and I are coming up on the anniversary of her father's death. He died a few years ago after a long, painful cancer battle. And a couple of years before John died, he was a super handsome guy, one of the greatest mentors I've ever had in my life. A couple of years before he died, he spoke at his brother's funeral in San Diego, and he talked about how death is the portal to life. And so I want to read you a few words from his speech. His speech was so amazing, I asked him for the transcript, and I've saved it. And so this is a direct quote from Jessica's dad speaking at his brother's funeral. He says, "So to the question then, what is death? Noah Webster tells us that death is the cessation of communication with a known environment." The cessation of communication with a known environment. I think that definition is very satisfying. May I tell you why? Let me illustrate with the normal birth of a baby. You know how it works. The baby, for approximately 9 months, develops faculties that don't have any practical usefulness while in the womb. The ideal environment for new life to grow: eyes, ears, nose, hands, feet, etc. Now, when the appointed time comes, that little life starts on the most harrowing trip imaginable. The 9 months of peace and security come to a frightful end. If there were other babies in the womb witnessing this event, their alarm at this sight and the corresponding loss of their beloved sibling would be overwhelming. Now, while these siblings would have the most anxious of expressions, those adults at the other end of the birth canal would be smiling, laughing, celebrating, no doubt talking like little babies themselves. While one group is saying goodbye, the other group is welcoming with jubilation this new life into the family and the world. The baby has ceased communicating with a known environment, only to exercise these previously useless faculties in a new environment. For everyone who has turned their lives over to Jesus, that is the reality. Jesus said so. But it's not just a reality for the beginning and the end of our lives. This is the portal. This is the principle. This is the magic. This is the power that can inject life into our lives. In the kingdom of God, life comes out of death. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." So here's the message. When we embrace the way of the cross, life follows us. If we live the cross life, our friendships and our marriages and our relationships get better. If we live the cross life, our reputations get better. If we die to leisure time, we suddenly are able to write poetry or books or screenplays. If we die to convenience, we can accomplish goals or set athletic personal bests. If we give our lives away, we find our lives in return. And listen, our world does not live this way. We are living at a time in history where our world is committed to preserving my life at all costs. How dare anyone infringe on my rights, my space, or my preferences? But listen, my friends, we are not of this world. We are of a different kingdom. On the night of Jesus' Last Supper with his followers, he took off his outer robe and he tied a towel around his waist and he washed their feet. And he said, what I've just done is I've set an example for you that you do the same to others. So listen, where do you need more life in your life? Whether you're high school age, whether you're young adult, middle-aged, retiree, I can tell you how to get it. The cross. Jesus was able to raise Lazarus to new life because he was about to give away his own life on the cross. And since he was Jesus, since he was God, his act of selflessness released life into the world. When that happened, his human adversaries went crazy. We got to stop this guy or the whole world is going to be following him. And when the human adversaries went crazy, the demon adversaries started cheering and they were like, it's about time. We've been trying to stop this guy for 3 years. Finally, they're actually going to make it happen. Do you remember Samson? The Nazarite judge with the long hair and the supernatural strength from God. You remember Samson? In Judges chapter 14, there's an interesting passage. He's walking through a vineyard. And as he's going through this vineyard, a lion lunges out at him and he kills the lion. Well, he keeps traveling, and a short time later, he comes back to the site of that battle, and he finds that bees have built a hive inside the carcass of the lion. So he scoops out some fresh honey, and he walks on his way eating honey. He gets to his wedding celebration, ultimately, and he poses a riddle to all of the guests. He's like, I'm going to say something to you. See if any of you can figure out what it is that I'm trying to say. And then he says these words. He says, out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. And that was an Old Testament picture of this principle. That's an Old Testament picture of the cross. Honey, sweetness, life out of the jaws of death. Let me remind you what was happening on the cross. We're about to spend a whole week here where we're focused on the cross. And on Good Friday, I'll be speaking, and I'm going to take us back into some of those moments. And on Easter, we're talking about the cross. Let me remind you what was happening there. In Romans chapter 8, verse 3, the Apostle Paul said this. He said, for what the law, and that's the rules, the regulation, the standard, it's the code that helps us live a perfectly righteous life before God. What the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, meaning we humans are not able to perfectly keep all of God's totally righteous laws. What the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did. Well, they're not going to be able to live up to this, and so I'm going to help them out. I'm going to actually do it for them. So God stepped into the human story, and he did it by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh. That is not referring to Jesus walking around as a man in his ministry. It's referring to Jesus on the cross when the sins of the world were planted on him. God did it by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. And so he condemned sin in the flesh, the sin that was wrapped up now inside him on the cross, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fully met in us who do not live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. I really want you to catch this. God placed the sins of the world on and in Jesus, so that when Jesus allowed himself to be crucified, the spear passed into Jesus, passed through him, killing the sin, even as he was being killed on the cross. He was like, hey, I know how to kill sin. Here's what we'll do. I want you to wrap up all the weight of the sins of the world, your sins, in me. And then I will offer myself up as an offering, and I'll just kill that sin with me. And yet, since Jesus was life, when he died with death and sin, he wasn't able to stay dead since he is life. And so that's how he was able to shake off death and step out of what we call the empty tomb, except the tomb wasn't actually empty. We always say it was an empty tomb on Easter Sunday. It was not an empty tomb. The corpse of sin was left behind while Jesus stepped out of the tomb into new life and then offering life for the world. And this is why the Apostle Paul could say in 1 Corinthians 15:54, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Listen, the cross can take some of the sting out of the loss of our loved ones. The cross can take some of the sting out of our failures and regrets. Do you know that life can even come out of your failures and regrets? The cross can take the sting out of the many little daily sacrifices we make. So at this stage in my life now, I have officiated many memorial services. And I've done enough now to know that the ones that are the most powerful, the ones that really make the greatest impact, are the ones where there's two things in place. One, there's an assurance of faith. So we know that while this loved one has experienced a cessation of communication with a particular environment, they are now communicating in a whole new way with God. When that's in place, it makes the setting incredibly special. But then number two, it's this. Whenever there's a line of people that want to stand up and say thank you for all of the little deaths that this person lived along the way. Oh, they sacrificed for me. They gave for me. They showed up for me. They worked hard for me. They loved me even when I wasn't easy to love. Jessica and I follow some Instagram accounts that are devoted to addiction and recovery, and we saw a picture on one. It was a neon sign, and it said, "Love me until I'm me again." Have you ever said, please, love me until I'm myself again? When somebody can stand up and testify that they loved me even when I wasn't me. They loved me until I was me. They were there, that they came through, they did their best. When there's a celebration of the little deaths along the way, it is a celebration of life. And life flows. Listen, those kinds of lives are evidence that life comes out of death. It's a universal truth, which means this works whether you know God or not. But it's a universal truth rooted in the fact that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And in his kingdom, life comes out of death. So listen, please, talk to your children about this. This is a life principle. Talk to your teenagers when they have a heartbreak. Remind them of this truth. Think about this in your lowest moments. Remember, out of the eater, there is something to eat. Out of the strong, there is still something sweet to be harvested. Life comes out of death. I didn't know what song Amanda was planning on ending the morning with. In fact, you can bring your team back up, Amanda. But when I finished writing my notes, I really wanted us to worship on Palm Sunday to that song, Behold Him, where our focus is just purely Jesus, nothing more, nothing less. And so I was going to text her, and I was going to say, hey, Amanda, I'm sorry, but whatever you have planned, can you axe it, and can you do Behold Him instead? And when I got on our planning center before I texted her, I saw that a couple days before she had changed her plans, and she had written in Behold Him. So we were already tracking on the same level. And I would love for us to officially begin Holy Week by standing and beholding Him. If you are here today, so you can do the first part, you can stand with me. If you are here today and you've never yet opened your heart to Jesus, if you're watching online, if you're here visiting with a friend, if you've never yet said, Jesus, I'm yours. I don't understand it all. I don't get it all. It doesn't all make sense, but something in my heart is aching for this to be true. I want you. I need you. Here I am. That step of asking him to come in, and we call it to become the Lord, the king of our lives, that's the first step to entering life like we have never known before. And when we take the grip that we have on the steering wheel of our lives, and when we let it go and say, I'm letting go of my control, my failures, my sins, my issues, my successes, and I'm surrendering to you, wash me, change me, forgive me, make a fresh start in me, we are stepping into that portal of life created through his death and his life. And if you have never done that, I just illustrated what to say internally and how to do that. And you can do that right now. And for any of the rest of us that are here as we worship, one, I want us just to love Jesus more. But two, I want more life in my life. I don't want to end my life being somebody who lived without really living. I want there to be so much life in my life that it squishes between my toes when I walk. I don't want to have to scrape a few drops out of a dry well. I want it to slosh out of me. And so, where do I need to die? If I want that kind of a marriage, how do I have to die for Jessica? If I want that kind of a relationship with the girls, where do I need to give my life away? If I want friendships that look like that, whose feet do I need to wash? If I don't want to be bound up inside, who do I need to forgive? Where do I need to get healing? Let's orient our lives around the cross today so that we can ultimately be with him in that garden tomb where life won the day. Let's worship.